how does an advocate of corporate welfare today compare with, let's say, Mussolini or Hitler of yesteryear? Like, are there any meaningful differences between the two systems?
There are meaningful differences.
Okay.
But, these are not the same systems. They have some similarities.
Yeah.
The German state was strongly supported by major corporate power, though they didn't much like it after it turned out the Nazis had ideas of their own. And in fact, big American corporate power isn't so happy about a lot of the things happening now either. They're not happy about there is a strain in the Gingrich army, which is sort of right-wing populist, but that means they're also against big business. And they are against handouts to big corporations. And the big corporations, of course, don't like that. They also don't like the fanaticism. The Christian fundamentalism is something that scares them a lot. The corporate executives are mostly what are called liberals, kind of cultural liberals, like they're militantly pro-abortion. They don't want their kids to be forced to repeat prayers in schools. They don't like guys running around with assault rifles and so on. And insofar as that's a segment of the Gingrich constituency, they're very unhappy about it. Gingrich himself is they like a big business. Fortune magazine's run a couple of polls on this, and they love what Gingrich is up to. Because he's just pouring money into their pockets. On the other hand, they don't like him, and they're worried about the people around him. And that's somewhat reminiscent of the attitudes of big business towards the Nazis in the late 30s, but these are different systems. You don't want to draw the lines too tight.
Well, the similarities I was thinking were in the results, especially in the non-Western or non-industrialized countries, that basically a corporate state and a fascist state seem to be searching for Lebensraum and at the expense of many people's lives, and perhaps when you factor global warming and other unsustainable industries into the equation, it could be at the expense of everybody's life.
Yeah, but these are the interests of private power.
Yeah.
It's kind of independent of system. I should say that these days, or after the Second World War, people think of fascism as being something that involves gas chambers and death camps and mass slaughter and so on and so forth. But fascism as a socio-political system was pretty much admired in the West. Mussolini, for example, was very popular in the West in the across the spectrum. Left liberals liked him. Franklin Roosevelt called him that admirable Italian gentleman, and in fact the U.S. continued to support him right after the war in Ethiopia. Franco was very popular, Franco-fascism in the West. In fact, he even won years later, even way after the war. He was being praised by Eisenhower and the Kennedy administration and so on for the wonderful things he did. He was straight fascist. Hitler Germany was very popular up until at least around 37 or so. The State Department, 1937, the State Department was advocating that we support Hitler as what they called a moderate, standing between the extremes of right and left, and if we don't support Hitler, we might have to worry about the masses rising up and maybe with the middle classes supporting them and overthrowing the system that we like. There was no great opposition to fascism, and in fact, back in those days, you will find books by very mainstream American political economists, like, say, Robert Brady, a very good political economist at Columbia University, wrote a very interesting book, must have been around, 1943 or so, called Business as a System of Power, in which he simply described similarities among the various state capitalist countries of the world, Germany, Italy, the United States, England, all of which were adopting, as he pointed out, rather adapted to their own conditions and circumstances, but rather similar policies of trying to integrate state power and private power into fascist-like systems with different variants. It became unfashionable to talk like that after the Second World War, but there was a lot to it, and it wasn't considered very strange then. Brady, for example, is pretty mainstream Veblenite economist.
Yeah, it's a shame they don't teach that. Teach the connections between our systems and classical fascism in elementary school.
Yeah, you can tell it by just looking at investment flows. After Mussolini took over in Italy and destroyed the parliamentary system instantly and instituted terror and destroyed the labor movement and so on, he was the absolute darling of the American business community. Italy, investment started pouring into Italy. I think it received the highest flow of investments probably in Europe in the 1920s. After Hitler took over, the investment flow started to shift to Germany. And in the 30s, Germany received more U.S. investments than any European country outside of England, where, of course, there are historic ties, reflecting general attitudes towards approval of what he was doing.
Was there any direct conflicts of interest between, let's say, the advertisers or the ownership of the New York Times and the Washington Post and their ability to, let's say, benefit from a military conflict in the Gulf? Or was it more informal structure of control, let's say, with the Washington press corps being manipulated by the White House or something?
Well, that goes into a level of detail which we don't have evidence about. Nobody knows what goes on the inside of private corporations.
Right.
They don't release documents.
No.
So we have to speculate. But what's interesting is that this pattern is highly consistent. It's been demonstrated. This is a pretty dramatic case of it, but the pattern itself has been illustrated in case after case. There's thousands of pages of documentation on this.
Mm-hmm. So nobody has made an analysis of, let's say, what advertisements appear in the New York Times or the Washington Post, if there's any defense contractors or oil companies?
Oh, yeah, you can do that, but it doesn't really tell you much. Like, for example, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the oil companies were in favor of a negotiated settlement.
Oh.
That's quite possible.
Right.
You know, these are things that you would know only if you had internal records. And remember, these are private tyrannies. They're not like governments. Governments have secrets, but at least, more or less democratic governments, bits and pieces leak out, and ultimately you get a fair amount of declassification. But you don't get declassification of records from Exxon. These are private tyrannies. These are totalitarian systems. They don't have any public accountability, and they don't tell you anything. That's why the Gingrich Republican types like them so much, because when you talk about the analogy to fascism, the real analogy is private corporations.
Right.
Those are totalitarian institutions.
Yeah.
We don't use the term for them because our ideological system keeps away from economic power and structure. But if we were honest about it, we would point out that these are basically about as close to totalitarian as any institutions humans have devised. Actually, if you look at their history, they came out of the same background as political fascism. The modern corporations were given their extraordinary rights and powers not that long ago. It's early in this century, and mostly by courts and lawyers, not legislation. And the thinking behind it, the intellectual background, is rather similar to what led to Bolshevism and fascism. And they're very similar in form. Totalitarian institutions unaccountable to the public, and very hierarchic and authoritarian in their internal structure.
So you would say that whereas some governments are semi-top-down with a little bit of feedback available, classical fascism and corporations share a completely top-down decision-making structure, and in that way they're similar?
Yeah, completely is too strong even for fascism, but very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, very much in that direction. Take, say, a corporation. Power is vested ultimately in the owners and investors. Control is done by the CEO and the board of directors. If the investors don't like it, they kick them out. The rest of the structure is very strictly top-down. If you're somewhere inside that system, say a junior manager, you get orders from above and you hand them on down below. And at the bottom, there are people who rent themselves to the place called workers. They don't have anything to say. Now, there's a little bit of feedback and interchange, but that was true even in Stalinist Russia. These are about as close to totalitarian as any institutions we know, and they're not small. They by now, the top 500 corporations, Fortune 500, control about almost 2/3 of American gross domestic product and a very big piece of the world economy.
So you're in favor of using the term totalitarian to describe corporations. What about the F word? Could you effectively, or could you make an argument to say that they're really, to say there's little or no difference?
I don't like to use the word fascist just because of its connotations. See, if we could go back to, say, the early 1940 and describe fascism as a socioeconomic and political system, okay, then it would be a system you could describe. But by now, fascism has it brings images of gas chambers and death camps and mass murder and so on. And of course, that's not true of these other institutions. I mean, maybe true of them, but it's not specifically true of these other institutions. So it's just kind of bringing the wrong imagery along with it. And it's become a kind of a word of abuse rather than a descriptive term. So